Church history, and now he's doing the second part of that, and it's going to be really great. Before he starts teaching this evening, though, I want to share with you about our upcoming widowhood or grief workshop or grief seminar with Jeff Jenkins. Jeff was widowed in 2019. He's a person who has been there, what it's like to lose a mate. I really want to encourage you as a congregation to come to this. We have, I think, 17 signed up. I'm not looking for numbers. I'm just looking for people to learn something about grief. Jeff knows something about that. He's a person who is able to empathize. Some of us can sympathize, but he's able to empathize because he's been there and he's lived it. And so in his first lesson, he's going to be talking about some things I wish I knew about grief before he really had to deal with it, okay? And that's on Saturday evening at 6:30. And so we'll have some refreshments afterwards. And then the next morning, he's going to do a second part, some things I wish I knew about grief. And then his second lesson is going to be beyond the valley of tears, beyond the valley of death. Now, here's the two reasons why I really want to encourage you to be here. Number one, if you're a married person, one of you are going to be left behind. That's just a fact. One of you are going to be left behind unless the Lord comes again. And so the more we can be aware of that and maybe armed about it, the maybe less severe that grief is going to be. Here's the second reason. In our congregation, we have 31 men or women who have lost their mates. And if you're like me and you haven't been through that kind of grief, you don't understand it. And I think for our congregation to have a better understanding of what our brothers and sisters are going through can help them when they go through this. And we'll be able better to sympathize with them. And so I would encourage you to come to this seminar, this grief seminar. All of us have had grief, okay? Grief comes in a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's grief over a person that we've lost that's our mate. But grief comes in a lot of other kinds of manifestations as well. And the more we can learn about that, I think the better it'll help us navigate through some of the hard times that we might go through in life. So that's just an encouragement. You're going to hear the same thing this coming Sunday morning when I speak to you about this seminar. So without further ado, Art.
Announcement, but the secretary's announcement is if you want to come to that, you need to register because they're going to be having food and they need to know how much food to buy. So Lori would appreciate you if you would register, and I think if you go to the emails and so forth, there's the last worksheet or bulletin that we did, I think even had a QR code. Lori's nodding her head, so that's right. So I'm not making that up. So, okay. We finished The Chosen. I know there's going to be several more seasons of it, but I think 3 seasons is probably all we're going to do in a classroom format. So if you enjoyed it, you want to continue to watch it, I encourage you to watch it on your own at home. I'm not sure what comes after this quarter. I will know before my quarter gets over and I'll be announcing it. But we did 2 quarters ago, church history on Wednesday night. We got up through the church fathers. We were getting into the period of persecution by the emperors, and so that's kind of where we're at now. But I'm going to do a little bit of review before we get to the emperors on some of these church fathers. Church fathers are the men that the leaders in the church that immediately followed the apostles and came, later in the 1st century and into the early 2nd century. And so all the way up into about 250, which would be mid-3rd century. So we've got those men, and I'm just going to summarize these real quick. Clement of Rome, he was one of 3 Roman elders. We're going to be talking about emperors in a minute. That after the apostles were in Rome, we'll talk about that, whether Peter was there. We know Paul was there and so forth. But Clement of Rome, in about 96 AD, he wrote a letter to the Corinthians. It was considered the earliest writing after the writings of the apostles and what became the New Testament. He referred to the authority of Paul and his letters, and he didn't claim any inspiration for himself. Clement didn't. And his work was pretty lengthy, and it had certain references to elders and bishops. And what's important about this was he was writing this, towards the end of the first century, and yet he made no distinction between elders and bishops. And that's going to change into the next century. So then the next person there was Ignatius of Antioch. His writings contradict a lot of what Clement wrote. He was an elder in the church at Antioch, and he was the first proponent of a bishop being the head of a local congregation and elders being his assistants. Now, that was not universal, but that was in Antioch what he proposed there. And so, but his concern was about combating heresy. And heresy was starting to come in, creep into the church when he was a leader in the church. And so the fewer leaders, he felt like the more faithful to the word the church could stay. So that was one of his reasons for doing that way. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying that's what he did. But he saw that the church needed strong organization, and unfortunately his writings carried a lot of weight, and it became a basis later on in the church for a departure from the original pattern regarding elders and bishops. Then you got Barnabas. Some people argue whether or not this was the Barnabas of the New Testament that was one of Paul's companions. He may or may not have been one of those, but he wrote the letter called the Epistle of Barnabas, and it was the central subject of that was a lot like Paul's writings to the Galatians and the Romans, showing the separation between Judaism and Christianity. And this was his writing the Epistle of Barnabas was a continuation of that, supporting that same idea that Christianity wasn't just an extension of Judaism, but it was for the whole world. Then you had Papias. A lot of these guys, we spent a few weeks talking about these different guys. None of his works survived. The reason we know his works is because you had people like Eusebius and Irenaeus, however you want to pronounce his name, that quoted him so much that we've got lots of his works through other people, but none of his actual works survived. And he died in 150 AD, and he used the term presbyter interchangeably for an elder or a bishop. And presbyter actually is a New Testament word too. So, it is a biblical word, but he didn't see any distinction between elders and bishops. He's also credited with the first one to bring up the millennial view, but that's neither here nor there for what we're doing right now. Polycarp of Smyrna, he was one of the first ones that was martyred after Stephen. He was an elder in Smyrna. He refused to acknowledge the emperor as a god, and it got him killed, along with several others in Smyrna. He served as an elder for 40 or 50 years before he died. Both Irenaeus and Tertullian say that Polycarp had been a disciple of John the Apostle. So he knew John the Apostle and had studied under John the Apostle. So that's when I say these church fathers immediately followed the apostles. A lot of them knew the apostles and followed them and studied with them and worked with them. He wrote a letter to Philippi, and it has been preserved in full, and it quotes 60 different passages from New Testament books and letters. And none of the ideas that are presented in his letter to Philippi are foreign to the teachings in the New Testament. So it kind of, gives additional weight to the New Testament, what he wrote. Then you've got Hermas. He wrote The Shepherd, called The Shepherd of Hermas, obviously. His brother, his name was Pens. He was a bishop in Rome from 140 to 155 AD. But he wrote this Shepherd, and it deals principally with the problem of forgiveness of sins after baptism. And a false teaching that was coming up by the time that he wrote this Shepherd of Hermas in 150 AD was the fact that once you were baptized, you were forgiven of your sins, but any sins you committed after baptism were unforgivable. Well, you can see how that would cause the church some problems. And so his whole book was basically written to refute that false teaching. The problem was he did such a good job of writing that and refuting that, and the fact that you could repent and be forgiven of your sins afterwards, that it was that book, The Shepherd, was basically used later in the 3rd and 4th century as, an additional sacrament of the church, repentance, and how they made that a sacrament. And we will have a whole lesson on how the sacraments go from 2 to 7 in the church, from the 1st century to the 3rd and 4th century. And we'll talk about that when we get there. I don't want to steal my thunder when I get to that. So then we've got Tatian. He wrote the Dia or Diatessaron. He defended Christianity. He was a well-educated Greek, Tatian was, and he defended Christianity as being superior to anything that the Greeks taught about their gods or about their philosophies. And he did a very good job of that. But that's not what the Diatessaron is about. The Diatessaron is notable as the first harmony of the Gospels. He took all 4 Gospels and put them together in chronological order and combined them where you could read his Diatessaron, and you went through all 4 Gospels at the same time and got the stories there, the history of the Gospels in chronological order. So that was his greatest work. Then, let me get to another page. Oh, Irenaeus or Irenaeus, however you want to pronounce that, it can be pronounced both ways. He was converted by Polycarp and was a disciple of his. He became the bishop at Lyon, or Charles isn't here. I pronounce it Lyons because that's the way it's spelled, but it's Lyon, I think. It's in Gaul, which is over, close to Spain, but really more France. In 177 AD, he was trying to unify the different sects that had come up in the church by then and keep Christianity together. And he appealed for a better organization in the church. And he traced bishops from the beginning of his day to prove that the right doctrine had been preserved. So if he could take a church in Rome or a church in Corinth or wherever the church was, and point to the fact that they had this unbroken succession of elders or bishops from the 1st century and the apostles up to present day, that was an argument for the fact that they were more likely a faithful congregation compared to one that couldn't do that. And so he looked at trying to prove right doctrine. He mentioned the church at Rome as founded by Peter and Paul, but he meant that only to show the heretics that right doctrine had been survived in the church in Rome. Unfortunately, later on in the 4th century, they used his writings to say, well, see, he's saying that Peter was the first pope. He nowhere mentions Peter as a pope. He nowhere mentions, he didn't even claim that Peter was the first bishop in Rome. And yet, a lot of people use what he said as evidence of that. Then you've got Clement of Alexandria. There they had this great school of sacred learning. He studied there and later became the head of that school. He was a good example of an intellectual Christian of his day, and he wrote several works that rebutted the popular philosophies and the Christian sects that contradicted the New Testament. And so he was what you might call an apologist. Well, Tertullian was actually a better apologist. An apologist technically was somebody that wrote a defense of Christianity to the Romans, and specifically to the Roman governors and emperors, to try and stop the persecution that was going on at the time that they wrote of Christians. But Tertullian, I got ahead of myself. I shouldn't have clicked this when I turned the page. He wrote his defense of Christianity in 197 AD. He was actually from Carthage, North Africa. His father was well up in the Roman army. He sent him to study as a lawyer in Rome. While he was in Rome, he was converted to Christianity, and he came back and used his education as a lawyer to defend Christianity to the Romans. Then you've got, and he wrote about 43 works that we have in existence today. So he was a pretty prolific writer. Not as much as Origen that we're going to get to in a minute, but he wrote a lot. Then you got Hippolytus. I think it's Hippolytus. Hippolytus, he became a bishop. He was a Roman bishop, and he became a bishop after the church in Rome split. You had the church in Rome. Part of it wanted to trace themselves back to Peter as the first bishop. Another part of the church said, we don't even have evidence that Peter was here, and he was the elder of the church that wasn't trying to make Peter a pope. And so he was the bishop of that part of the Roman church. And so he was an opponent of the trans president in the Roman church. But on the other side, too, he also recognized the distinction between bishops and elders by the time you get to the beginning of the 3rd century. And he was also the last to write in Greek. After him, everybody writes in Latin. He's the last church leader that writes in Greek. So, then the last one that we'll mention before we get to the emperors is Origen. He studied under Clement of Alexandria. He was a prolific writer. He was brilliant. Sometimes he was too smart for his own good because he came up with theories that everybody else scratched their head at. But he produced, for instance, the Old Testament in 6 different languages, side by side, 6 columns. That was 9,000 pages. I don't even know what all 6 languages they were. Maybe it was Aramaic and Hebrew and Latin and Greek. But there were 6 languages that he produced the whole Old Testament in one volume. He also wrote commentaries on each book of the Bible. And of course, when he was writing those were on scrolls. There were 291 scrolls of his commentaries. So Origen, I don't think the guy slept. Or he lived to be 200, I don't know which, but he produced a lot. And his fundamental works showed great faith early in his career, but then, and he showed a rich understanding of Scripture, but then he started getting off into these other theories, and he lost, at the end of his career, a lot of credibility with what he wrote later on. Really destroyed his credibility because he was, I guess I could best describe his later writings as exotic and far-fetched. And I'll just leave it at that. I won't give you any examples of what some of them might have been. But okay, so that brings us to the persecution of the emperors, by the emperors. So originally, when you go back and look at the beginning of the church, the Romans considered Christianity and Christians to just be another sect of Jews. They didn't make any distinction between them and Pharisees, Sadducees, whatever Jewish sect it might be. They just thought that the Christians were like the Jews. And they had their roots in Judaism. Of course, their founder, Jesus, was a Jew. And the suspicions charged to the Jews by the Romans in the 1st century were passed on to the Christians. You have to remember that when you look at the history of Rome, and it goes back, into the BCs, back well before Christ, the Romans were very good about tying their politics and their religion together. And if you were going to be involved in the politics, you were also involved in the religion of Rome and their Roman gods and so forth. And there was this close relationship between the Roman government and the Roman religion. So religion was supported by the government, and it became akin to patriotism is the best way, since yesterday was the 4th of July, that I can describe it. If you were faithful to the Roman gods, you were considered patriotic to the Roman government, in a sense. Okay? So now then, along come the Christians, and they won't worship any of the Roman gods. So that was considered more than just unpatriotic. it was considered, rebellious. So at first, Judaism in Palestine was unmolested by the Roman conquerors. This was when Rome first came into Palestine. But the Jewish leaders were not content to remain under Roman rule. So they started causing problems for the Romans. And it didn't take the Romans long to get a distaste for the Jews and to not be kind to the Jews. They were willing to let the Jews at the beginning make an exception for them and let them have their one God, as long as they didn't cause problems. But the Jews weren't content with that, because the Jews thought that they were nationalistic in their own right and wanted to have their own country, their own place that didn't have a conquering nation over them. And so you had that going on between the Jews and the Romans, and then the Romans started having problems with the Jews, and then they extended that to the Christians, because in their mind at first, in the first century, the Christians were nothing but an extension of the Jews. So it started causing the Christians to have problems, because look at the Christians. Their background was in the law and the prophets. They quoted the law and the prophets as their scripture before the New Testament was written. Jesus was a Jew. The gospel was first preached among the Jews before they went to the Gentiles. And the first place they preached their gospel was in the synagogues. So you can see why the Romans would get very confused about this. Now, as the Christians spread out and started proselyting people all over the world, the Jews did their best to try and say, these guys are not Jews. And so, but the Romans had some contempt and suspicions of the Christians, because they thought they were like, yes. Right. And the Romans probably wouldn't have had a problem with thinking of them a lot like the Jews if the Jews weren't doing their best to say they're not Jews. They, don't think of them like us. They're different from us, and they. So Christianity did not have any legal status. In fact, it was illegal until Constantine's edict in Milan in 313 AD, which is down the road in our class a little bit, but we may get to it. I doubt I'll get to it in the next 18 minutes. But the teaching that Christ is the King of Kings and that Christians share in that kingdom and are sealed with a covenant from God, that was considered a threat to the peace in the Roman Empire. It was considered a threat to the security of the state of the Romans. And accordingly, a lot of Romans and a lot of Roman governors wanted to eliminate Christianity. Yes, Dave.
How would that differ?
I don't have a microphone, so how would that differ from the Jews? As far as no legal status? Well, Rome didn't. It depends upon what period of time you're talking about. Rome tolerated the Jews at different periods through history, because if they tolerated them, they caused them less problems. And so you could have a governor come in, and we kind of saw that in The Chosen some, and the governor was going to get grief from the emperor if it was reported back that you had these factions that were rebellious in Israel and in Palestine. So he would kind of go along to get along with the Jews so that he didn't get these bad reports to Rome. So a lot of times they would, but then there's other times when it became necessary, to crack down on the Jews, that they would say, no, you guys aren't recognized because you won't worship our gods. Richard, we got a microphone finally. Thank you. I'm out of practice.
Also, the Romans had had puppet kings in terms of Herod the Great
Yes.
was seen as a king, or Antipas was seen as a king. So there were numerous Jewish individuals that they would call kings, but their kingdoms, or them as kings, was limited to what the power of Rome would allow them to
Yes.
have.
This is and to get all this family tree of the Herods on here, I know it's kind of small, but up here you got Herod the Great. He was the king of the Jews when Jesus was born, okay? And he's kind of the beginning of the family here. And then you've got these different wives, but Cleopatra, and this isn't the Egyptian Cleopatra. There was actually a Cleopatra that was also in Jerusalem too. But this was one wife, and her son was Philip the Tetrarch. Now, I'm getting this out of order, and I'm going to have to find my numbers here to explain these. But this is a good place since Richard raised the question. Here we go. Philip the Tetrarch, he was over the northern territories, and he later married Herodias' daughter Salome, who was also his grandniece, by the way. But you see a lot of that going on with the Herods. He had Herod Antipas, who was the Tetrarch of Galilee, and he was Herodias' uncle and second husband. After Salome's dance and his rash promise, he executed John the Baptist over here because Salome asked for his head, because her mother told her to ask for him, because she was first married to Herod Philip, but then she left him and went to Herod Antipas, and then later married King Herod Agrippa. So Herodias got around. And it's not like she was a widower and married these people. She just decided she wanted to change husbands. And then John the Baptist came in here and said, you den of vipers, and called them all kinds of names, and basically said, you're breaking the law of Moses by the things you're doing. And she didn't like that, so she had her daughter dance in a way that got Herod to promise her whatever she wanted, and what she asked for was John the Baptist's head. So, but it was King Agrippa that was the Herod when James, the son of Zebedee, was executed in the first century. He was the Herod that imprisoned Peter. And then under Herod Agrippa, then you had Bernice and Herod Agrippa II, and also under here, one of his daughters was Drusilla. Drusilla married Antonius Felix, and Felix was the one that heard Paul and didn't let Paul out of prison and let him sit there for 2 years until somebody else came along and heard him, and then he appealed to Rome and was sent to Rome. So there's a lot of Herods, and it's easy to get them mixed up. Me just trying to explain them to you with looking at the chart, I can get mixed up. But you got Herod. Oh, what did I do? I went the wrong way, I think. There we go. I was pushing the wrong way. You had Herod the Great, and then Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus, and he never ruled anything, I don't think, this Herod Archelaus. He was an ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, but he was replaced in 6, we would say AD, but in this chart it's CE, by a series of Roman governors, including one of his replacements was Pontius Pilate. And we got a question here by Clint.
The Herods are Jews, though, right?
Yes and no. They're in the general family. He said the Herods are Jews, right? They're Hasmoneans, and Hasmoneans were in the family of the Jews, but I would have to go and do some research to figure out exactly what that relationship was. You know, you go back and you say the Edomites. Well, the Edomites weren't Jews, but the Edomites, you go back to Abraham, and they're cousins. I mean, they're related. So the Hasmoneans may have been cousins more than Jews, but I'm not 100% sure, Clint. You may be right. They may have been Jews.
Well, because John's review about the law would have to have some application.
And I don't know if it was because they were Jews or because they were ruling over the Jews, and so he was holding them as being subject to the same law. I'm not sure. I didn't look that one up. I try to anticipate people's questions. That wasn't one I anticipated, so. Okay. So I need to get back to where I was because I jumped out of order here. So Christianity had no legal status. I think I got past that, but so then the Christians began to be accused of absurd crimes. And these accusations included things like cannibalism, drinking human blood, incest, infanticide. I'm mispronouncing that maybe, but revolution and even atheism. You think, how could they be considered atheists? But it's because they didn't worship any of the visible gods that the Romans worshiped, or that the Greeks worshiped, or that anybody else worshiped other than the Jews. And so they were considered atheists because they would, you know, the Romans would go to their sacrifices for their gods, and who was always notably absent? The Christians. They didn't come. So they thought, these guys must be atheists. They don't worship our gods. But these things that they were accused of, there's two chief reasons why these accusations were made. One was the development of extreme Gnosticism, and I'll get to that in a minute. But also, you had these secret societies that were illegal, pagan societies in the Roman Empire. One was the Roman Druids, and you've probably heard of the Druids in England, but you had these around the Roman Empire, you had these Druids. And then you also had these Bacchanalia folks. And both of them were guilty of infanticide or cannibalism and some of those sort of things. And they had these secret societies and these secret meetings that nobody got to come to or were privy to or knew about except for them. And so they gave these secret meetings a real bad name. So when you go into this long period of persecution, what's the first thing that the Christians have to do to keep from being killed? They had to hide their worship and meet in secret. Okay, so if they're meeting in secret, then a lot of the Romans are going to start thinking they're a lot like these Bacchanalia guys and these Druids. You know, they're doing these secret things. And so they started associating them with these same things that they were doing. The other thing was Gnosticism. Gnosis basically just means the word literally is translated knowledge. But the Gnostics were thought to, you know, they led people to believe that they had this secret knowledge. And there were two extremes in Gnosticism. And they both had to do with the belief that matter in and of itself is evil. All matter is evil. So that's the first premise. The second premise is that the human body is matter. So we need to try and rid ourselves of the human body. So that's why I said there were two extremes. One extreme was they were aesthetics. And so they tried to deny the body of as much as they could to get as far away from the material and to cross over into that spiritual realm of their secret knowledge. And so that asceticism was you didn't eat for pleasure. You ate, you know, a little, just enough to keep your body alive. You drank just enough to keep your body alive. You slept a minimum amount. You know, a lot of us wouldn't make it as these ascetics. Okay? I wouldn't make it. Bacchanalia, I don't know. I think they ate a lot. So, no, they were guilty of a lot of other things. So, forget I said that. But, so that was one extreme with the Gnostics. The other extreme was that you tried to burn the body out. So you drank as much as you could. You ate as much as you could. You did as much of everything that you shouldn't do as you could to try and kill the body with excess and with extremes. And if you reached a certain point, then you crossed over into this spiritual realm also. Okay, so that was the two extremes of the Gnostics. Okay, and so these things were all taking place at the same time. And the problem is the Druids, the Bacchanals, I think is the name of the people that were worshippers of Bacchanalia, they did not claim to be Christians. The Gnostics, on the other hand, claimed to be Christians. So what you had was these apologists, these Christian writers that we just talked about earlier, that had to try and fight against what these Gnostics were teaching, and that wasn't really what Christianity was about. You know, so the average Roman citizen believed that since the Christians didn't take part in their worship of their public gods, that they were atheists, that they were godless, that they were disloyal. Okay, I got 5 minutes. Let's see how many emperors I can get through. Tiberius, he was the emperor that was the emperor when Christ was crucified. It was during his reign that the church spread and was accelerated by the jealousy of the Jews, and the persecution after the martyrdom of Stephen, when the Christians were scattered out of Jerusalem all over the known world. Okay. But they still were not officially persecuted by the Romans. Here, the persecution is coming from the Jews, not the Romans. Okay. The Romans aren't persecuting them at this point. Then you get to Caligula. And that's not really the guy's name. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. Caligula is the nickname that his soldiers in Germany or Germanica gave him. And literally it means little boots. So I don't know if he had small feet or what, but it means little boots. And so that was his nickname, Caligula. And he didn't really have any official persecution, but he laid the groundwork for the persecution. Because the Jews were rebelling at the time in Jerusalem. So he said, I'm going to take care of those Jews. So he made statues of himself and put them in every synagogue, and had a giant one made to put in the temple in Jerusalem. The problem is, you see there, he didn't live very long. They got that statue made. They sent it over to Jerusalem. They had it sitting in the city, about to put into the temple, and he died. So, of course, the next emperor is not going to want to put the picture of the past emperor, this image in Jerusalem. So they just got rid of it. But he was murdered before it was put in place in the temple. But it did go into a lot of the synagogues. Then you got Claudius. I got all my... And he was the one that gave Judea to Herod Agrippa to rule. The Jews turned against him, against the Christians, and he killed James, the son of Zebedee. That's in Acts 12:2. The Jewish opposition reached all the way to Rome. When Claudius became the emperor, the Jews were immediately released from their obligation to put an image of the emperor deity into their temple. And of course, Herod Agrippa was a native, so he was sympathetic to the Jewish feeling. And he was also sympathetic to the Jewish feeling about the Christians. So he was willing to persecute the Christians, if it satisfied his Jewish friends. Okay, we talked about that one. Then you got Nero. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, if you look at the historical accounts, I think he was actually a harpist. I think he was playing a harp instead of a fiddle. He had a palace in Rome, and he didn't think his palace was quite big enough. And he was in the process of trying to buy land around his palace to expand his palace, but things weren't going fast enough for him. So this is all the historians thinking now. He got the idea that maybe if I set a little fire, close to my palace, it'll burn some of these places down, and I'll get a better price for this property I want to build to expand my palace. What he wasn't counting on was they didn't have a fire department. Most of these buildings were wood. I don't know if there was a strong wind or what, but there was this conflagration, big fire, went on terribly for 6 days, and then to a lesser extent for another 3 days. For 9 days, this thing burned. By the time it got done, 75% of Rome had been destroyed. Okay? And then people started saying, how did this start and everything? And guess what? They're starting to say, well, we know, in the Senate, they're going, we know that Nero was trying to buy all this property, and all of a sudden, that's where the fire started. So people started wanting to blame Nero. So then Nero's going, now wait a minute. If I'm going to last as the emperor, he lasted another 5 years, but past 64 AD, I got to find a scapegoat. So he blamed the Christians on starting the fire. And then that wasn't bad enough. He started, one of the things that burned was the circus in Rome. The circus was the biggest building in Rome. May have been the biggest building in all of the ancient world at the time. It would house over 100,000 people. Back in the 1st century. Anyway, that burned. So he had to use his gardens to satisfy the people with the games. And one of the most despicable things he did was he lit the gardens at night by taking Christians and putting them on stakes and coating them with flammable things like tar and then lighting them as torches. The other thing he did was he put them in animal skins and then put them out, into these arenas. Couldn't put them in the circus because it was destroyed, and sicked packs of wild dogs on them and stuff that just tore them to pieces and stuff. Just terrible things like that. But anyway, people that didn't like the Christians became sympathetic towards the Christians by the end of his persecution because he was being so terribly cruel in the way that he punished them. And we will start with the next emperor after Nero. Well, we're going to have to talk about Nero a little bit more because it's going to get interesting about Peter and Paul. Because there's some interesting things about Peter that I want to point out to you that are contrary to what a lot of people think. Okay, thank you for your time. Any last questions while the kids are making their way in here? Thank you for your attention. I'll try and get farther next time. I've got a lot of places to get to. Here we go. We've got organizational apostasy after we get past the persecution of the emperors, and then doctrinal apostasy. Then we're going to get to the 4th and 5th century and the change in the sacraments, the religious rites of the Christians. Then we're going to spend 2 weeks on the Middle Ages, 2 weeks on the Reformation, and then 2 weeks on the Restoration movement. I'm hoping I don't run out of those last 2 weeks. That's only 12 weeks, by the way. So, actually, 10 weeks. But at the rate I'm going to need every week I've got. So, thank you very much for your attention.